In 1990, the Archie Adventures of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles introduced a mutant flatworm with some suspicious similarities to a previous TMNT character named Bloodsucker. Over the years, fans have speculated that the character was created as an in-house replacement for Bloodsucker due to the copyright issues around him. But is this a fact or a myth? Join me today as I explore the original Wyrm, his toy adaptation, and the myth behind his creation. Wyrm was created by Ryan Brown in 1987 while working on possible stories for Tales of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, a bi-monthly Mirage book. Ryan had already created another famous mutant for this comic, Leatherhead, but the book was cancelled, and with it, any chances of Wyrm making it into the Mirage universe. In the original concept, Wyrm was proposed as an antagonistic, mutated leech. According to Ryan, the inspiration for the character came from the 1959 movie Attack of the Giant Leeches. Another big visual inspiration for the character was the art style of Ed Big Daddy Roth. As for the name, Wyrm is an Old English word that means serpent, as that was the original form of what we now know as the dragons from European tradition. In fact, the word comes from a medieval folktale known as the Lambton Worm, a tale I will have to come back to later in this video. Wyrm had to wait until 1990 to make his debut in the Archie Adventures universe, in a story plotted by Steve Murphy and Ryan Brown, with a script by Murphy and art by Ken Matroni, Dan Berger, Gary Fields, and Barry Grossman. Wyrm was the product of Bebop and Rocksteady's careless dumping of toxic waste into the sewers. The ooze mutated him from a harmless planarian flatworm into an ugly carnivorous monster that called itself Wyrm. Wyrm's mutation included long, extendable fingers with a squid's suction power. This was clearly a remnant of Wyrm's original concept. Leeches use suction to eat, and the suction power of squids was one of the attributes of the giant leeches from that 1959 movie that inspired Ryan. But since Wyrm was now a flatworm, a more accurate attribute was added to him, an extendable suction tongue with its own set of teeth. Flatworms have an extendable pharynx that they use to eat other animals. Of course, Wyrm's tongue looks like something out of an Aliens movie, but you get the idea. Wyrm has another ability that I'll talk about a bit later. Unlike other mutants in this universe, Wyrm had a primal motivation: eating other living beings. He ran into the turtles while they were looking for the Shredder's underground lair. He lurked in the water, waiting for the right moment to attack them, but his hunt got interrupted by the sudden appearance of another mutant, Scumbag. It was a stressful day for the turtles, who are now being disputed as these two mutants' dinner. Wyrm attacked Scumbag with his tongue and realized he was a much more interesting meal. The two got into a brutal fight, and in the heat of the battle, they broke a natural gas pipe and a high-voltage switch. This caused an explosion that left the turtles assuming the two mutants had been destroyed. But the mutants weren't dead. I mentioned earlier that Wyrm had a hidden ability. He wasn't just a flatworm. He was a colony of them. Being able to divide into multiple mini-worms, the mutated flatworm kept Scumbag alive to feed off him, never letting him die completely. This went on for years, until they were found by Mac and Squint, two journalists who were following April and Oyuki with the mission of getting the turtles on tape. After seeing the two humans, Wyrm merged back into himself, interested in the surprise change of menu. But Scumbag was angry at him and hungry for revenge. Desperate, Wyrm convinced Scumbag that there was enough for both to eat, and therefore declared a truce and joined forces to hunt the two men. Chasing them, they eventually ran into the reason Mac and Squint were down there in the first place. The turtles, April and Oyuki, were being chased by a strange alien named Toxeme. The sight of this alien made the duo of mutants forget about the two men and immediately try to eat Toxeme. Unfortunately, they were completely out of their depth, and the alien turned them into crystal structures before leaving the planet. It was unclear if this was the end of these two. When Mac and Squint tried to take the structures with them, they crumbled into a million pieces. Having said that, Wyrm and Scumbag survived an explosion before, so who knows? Wyrm never appeared again, or at least not officially. He was meant to return in the Forever War saga. This story was recently completed as part of a fan project using pre-existing, never-published material. It was revealed that his appearance was on an alternate timeline where he was working for the Shredder. It was in this fan project that Wyrm apparently killed an alternate version of Carter before getting eaten by rats himself. Wyrm was submitted to Playmates and later approved for development. After a few redesigns, Wyrm ended up having a similar but quite unique look compared to his original incarnation. He was released in 1991. The action figure was designed by Dave Archie, who was also going for a Rat Fink vibe. Unlike the Archie version, the Playmates origin seemed influenced by the Toxic Avenger. Unsurprising, considering Playmates and Dave were both working on the Toxic Crusaders around the same time. According to his bio, Wyrm was a mild-mannered garbage man who slipped and fell headlong into Shredder's garbage bin. This transformed him into a mutant planarian worm. Interestingly, he wasn't part of the heroes or the villains. He was embarrassed by his current state and stench, so he moved into the sewers, where he became the director of the unsanitation department. Down in the sewers, Wyrm fed on worms and rubbish he would tenderize with his compactor mallet. Wyrm was a loner, but given that they shared the same environment, he became friends with Muckman. Curiously, Muckman was a sewer worker in the toy line, but a garbage man in the cartoon. This may have been an obstacle for adapting the character into the show, but some characters were simply not popular enough to make the jump. Still, these action figures were sometimes advertised with bits of animation showing the characters in action. Wyrm was just another character that was animated for advertisement, but unlike the other figures in his wave, he never appeared in the cartoon, and this made those few seconds the only animated version of Wyrm until the 2012 show did its own take on the character. Based on the design of that brief appearance, NECA released an action figure this year. Back to the original action figure, Wyrm had some interesting play mechanics. His mouth could be opened, revealing worms coming out of his mouth. Additionally, pushing his hair could make his eyes bug out. Apart from his mallet, he came with a porcupounder, a mammal mallet that looks like a wrench, a worm knife, a worm belt, and 6 worms to feed him. There was another possible reason for Wyrm not to have been adapted into the Fred Wolf cartoon. He was already a part of the Mighty Mutanimals animation Bible in 1992, so it would have made more sense to introduce him as a villain in that show. It was probably because of the existence of the toy that the character was proposed in the same style. Unfortunately, the Mutanimals cartoon never materialized, for reasons I explained in my Mighty Mutanimals video. Earlier, I mentioned the Lambton Wyrm folktale. The legend tells of John Lambton, a young man who skipped church to go fishing in the River Ware. Unfortunately, the only thing he caught was some sort of unearthly worm. Thinking it evil, the young man threw the worm into a nearby well. John would go on to join the Crusades, only to return home to find it under the terror of a huge mutated worm that polluted the well it was thrown into and started eating the cattle. To defeat him, John asked a witch for advice, and she suggested he cover himself with spiked armor so that the worm would end up reducing itself to shreds while trying to crush him. This very old tale has many similar themes with the River trilogy, the story that Rick Veitch wrote and introduced Bloodsucker. It's very likely that Rick knew about this legend when he wrote The River, which on itself reminds us of how different creators could come up with similar characters and stories. Comic book history is filled with cases of characters being inspired by another work. This was the case of the Swamp Thing and Man Thing, who came out simultaneously, but both were inspired by a previous character named the Heap. In this case, the Lambton Wyrm legend inspired other literary works, like the Book of the Dung Cow and Bram Stoker's The Lair of the White Worm. Thanks to these stories, Ryan came up with the name Wyrm. However, apart from these connections between the two characters, the question about their creation persists. Is the fan theory that Wyrm was created because they couldn't use Bloodsucker true? Well, we now know that Wyrm was created in 1987 as a possible antagonist for the Tales of the TMNT book. This predates Bloodsucker, who appeared in the main TMNT book in 1989. Of course, Wyrm didn't appear until 1990, a year after Bloodsucker's debut, so Rick Veitch couldn't have known about him. This makes me think that we're looking at a Swamp Thing Man-Thing situation. In terms of the fan theory that suggests that Wyrm was made in response to Mirage not owning Bloodsucker, this is a weak argument. The River trilogy was created through an informal arrangement at the time, and the story was reprinted and collected a few times around the world until 1992. Since the collected editions stopped that year, it is possible that this coincided with the retroactive work-for-hire contracts sent by Mirage to own the stories made by other artists. By 1992, Wyrm had already appeared in the Archie comics and the toyline, so his creation wasn't a reaction to those retroactive contracts. A more interesting argument would be that Wyrm could have been created as an in-house version of Bloodsucker. Another weak argument. Not because Wyrm predates Bloodsucker, but because most of the characters created for the Archie comics were also not owned by Mirage. At least, not at the time. So I don't think Wyrm should be considered a copy of Bloodsucker. Both characters were created independently. I couldn't find out why Wyrm was changed into a flatworm, but it was a good choice, as it helped differentiate the two characters and gave Wyrm some interesting abilities and visual attributes. Given that the Adventures book was being published by Archie Comics, it crossed my mind that perhaps the change from Leech to Flatworm had to do with the comic code, which at the time was still limiting how graphic bloodsucking could be. However, all that Ryan could remember about this was that the comic code wasn't a reason for the change. Another reason for not believing in this fan theory is the lack of motivations to create a workaround character. This wasn't a situation where the Turtles faced similar themes or challenges. The stories with Wyrm in them are very different from the River. This is a different case from the Creep, the character created for the 2012 cartoon. In the context of that show, it made sense to introduce a character within a similar premise, because the story and the character were an homage to the River. So, hopefully we can put this fan theory to rest? What are your thoughts on Wyrm? Do you prefer the Archie or the Playmates version? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. See you in the sewers.